I've got a monster of a video for you today. But don't get scared. You definitely want to watch this one all the way through. I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down and having a conversation about lore and world building with Peter Chiykowski, the creator of the story engine, the Deck of Worlds, and now a brand new prompt generation tool for writers and people who play TTRPGs called the Loremaster's deck. We talked about all sorts of stuff, and you don't want to miss it. This conversation comes from a podcast episode we did for the Worldcraft Club. For anybody who doesn't know, the Worldcraft Club is a podcast where we talk about world building and its application to writing. So if you like podcasts, definitely check that one out. For anybody who's new to this channel, my name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author with over 21 books written, and I'm excited to have you here. Without further ado, let me invite you into a fantastic conversation with Peter Chiykowski. Worldcraft Club family, we have a very exciting episode for you today. We are going to be talking with Peter Chiykowski. We are so excited to have Peter back on the podcast. If you don't know who he is the author and illustrator of the delightful webcomic Rock, Paper, Cynic. He created the story engine. He has built a tremendous product in the Deck of Worlds, which is a just absolutely wonderful world building tool to help you sort of unleash your creativity. He's a master of short form stories, a crowdfunding expert, if I can call him that. And he is coming out with a new product that we are just really excited to see. It's called the Loremaster's deck. And I am so excited to explore with him the impact it's going to have on your world building. Peter, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our last conversation so much talking about world building, and I had one of those I left that call to go I always after I talk to someone, I'll go tell my wife about here's a conversation I had. I was just we had this million conversations about world building and the perspective of the visitor and how you make it compelling and make them feel like they're part of it. And I always I remember the conversations that I leave with that much excitement, even years later. And so it's really fun to be back. Excited to have another one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are about to launch, and if I get any of these details wrong, just jump in and be like, Seth, that's totally wrong. This is the truth. But you're about to launch on June 24th. I'm sorry. You're about to launch on June 20th on BackerKit, this new project, the Loremaster's deck. Talk to me a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so Loremaster's deck is a new deck of creative prompts that I've been working on to help writers, world builders, game masters come up with the different types of little pieces of lore that make up a world and make it feel interesting and compelling. And then also that help them assemble those pieces into a network or an ecosystem that really makes them feel connected and tangible and alive. Because I think that one of those challenges we can have sometimes is we have this random idea and this random idea and this random idea, and then connecting them or making them feel like they're part of the same world becomes a challenge. And I think one of the things that was both the biggest design challenge when I was working on this deck, but also I think the biggest design opportunity and what's really made it something that's fun and special and different is that it really organically helps you piece by piece create a lore web so that every single part of it is connected to another part in some way that is either meaningful or interesting or tickles that lore itch of when you find out this modern order of druids was actually used to be this secret blood cult and they're the same thing from history. Those moments, I really like being able to set up those little connections that can be surprising to you as a writer or as a creator, and that then therefore end up being very satisfying for readers or for visitors too when they explore your world in whatever medium.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just such joy in being able to step into a setting, step into a world, and see the connections between everything. So it doesn't feel like you're just sort of stumbling into a bunch of disparate scenes, but instead there's this sense of immersion that appears. Now, your Deck of Worlds, which I've played with myself, I've used with my kids, and it has just been a fantastic tool. So for anybody who's listening to this or hasn't seen the Deck of Worlds, definitely check it out. But the way it works is you flip out a series of cards from a series of decks, and you can use them to build. I don't know if randomized is the right term, but you can use them to sort of build out prompts that can then spark ideas, and you start building that way. What I found though with the Deck of Worlds was that as I would do that, I would typically get one or two things built and then like prompts built. And then from there, I would start coming up with sort of the connections between them myself. Right. And it sounds like the Loremaster's deck shortcuts that process by adding that functionality. Are these decks designed to be used together, or are they sort of separate pieces?
I would say both. So
Okay.
with all of my things that I design, I want it to be a standalone product. Like I don't want it to require you to buy a bunch of other things. I want you
Sure.
like you buy this box and it comes self-contained and it does the thing. So
Yeah.
Loremaster's deck does the thing. You buy that and it'll you can create locations with it. You can create like functions of other decks that I've designed, like Story Engine deck. You can create characters with it.
Right.
This deck has that capacity as well. But what you can do if you have, say, the Story Engine or you have Deck of Worlds, is you can draw on those card types to supplement the number of potential card draws and combinations in Loremaster's deck. So yeah, you can use it entirely on its own. If you already have the deck, then you just basically get like an exponentially larger number of potential combinations. And we're going to include a little section in the guidebook that explains like, hey, you can substitute card type A for card type B, or you can like draft and pick between like you can draw three landmarks from the Deck of Worlds in place of like one location card from Loremaster's deck. So
Okay.
yeah, it just basically increases the number of opportunities that you have when you combine them. And we're also working on a little bridge expansion that will like explicitly link them. So cues from one type of card will call for cards from the other set.
Oh, that's cool.
Which would be nice because then you can like if you're doing Deck of Worlds in your world building, if you have a card that reminds you like, okay, actually this location is going to have a faction, and then you build that
Mhm.
faction with Loremaster's deck, it just creates a much more dynamic and organic way to like remember to incorporate all these cards because there's enough card types now that it's just like helpful to have that structure to remind you like, okay, this place will
Right.
be faction based, this place is going to have a really interesting creature, this
Yeah.
place is going to have like a particular deity that they worship, and then there's support for creating all those types of things using the Loremaster's deck or its expansions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, a question for you. If you're in the process or like as you're building out these what do you call them? Tableau
So
is the word that came to mind, but like what do you call the what you build out?
yeah, so I've been calling each individual piece of a lore web a lore prompt,
Okay.
and I often will call because like a lore prompt can be for a faction or an historical
Right.
figure or an event or a location, an object, a physical material, or a like creature or species. Because there's like
Hmm.
a very distinct categories for these, I've been calling those like elements as well. So
Okay.
a card type is like one element of your lore, and then when you flesh that out with a couple supporting prompts and cues that might provide some like texture or detail about this prompt. And actually, like, let me give a concrete example just so that we're not trying to
Sure.
like, oh, imagine how these cards work. So let's say we draw a faction, and let's draw a faction. Let's do this
Yeah, let's
live
do it.
quickly. All right, so I'm drawing a faction card here. Printed on the card, there are 4 different cues. There are words that
Hmm.
you can pick between that are going to be like the basis of what our faction is. So our faction could be a church, it could be a mob, it could be a nation, or it could be a division. All of the words are backwards on my screen, so I
Right.
actually have to peek at the card. I can't just
So
hold it
that's
up to the
really
camera.
impressive that you were able to nail them.
What's a bomb? Oh,
Right.
mob. Yeah. So like we could do I like church is a fun one. I always like doing churches and
Hmm.
seeing like belief systems I find really, really interesting. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with church for this one. But I'll put that down, I'll turn the word church so that it's facing me, and that's how I know that's the cue that I'm using, is the active cue. It's the one facing me. And then I'll pull another faction card, but this time I would use the back side of the card, which has like these prompts that are specific to providing details about what a faction might be like. So
Hmm.
some of these are backgrounds, some of these are traits, and some of these are agendas, or like what is the faction trying to do or achieve.
Hmm.
And on every card, there will usually be at least 2 of these cues that have another icon, another symbol for another card type, which means that they could potentially connect to another card. So
Gotcha.
on this card, our church could be linked to a war crime. They could have an agenda to lobby for a specific political or social issue. They could have a trait where they consider a specific location to be sacred, or they could have a confusing or complicated constitution. Any of those interest you?
I like the war crime one.
All right, we've got a church that did a war crime. We're
Yeah.
starting. We're going hard right off the
Yeah,
bat.
we are.
And then right off the bat, also because the war crime has an event card, we would pull an event to see what kind of crime this might be. So it could be a betrayal, it could be a deluge, it could be a hunt, or it could be a descent.
Oh, interesting. I think that the war crime should be related to a betrayal.
Cool. All right, so we've got a betrayal there. And then we'll grab another one of these. We'll fast forward this a little bit, but
Yeah.
they are keepers of. Oh, actually, I think these are the same cards that I pulled in a recent prompt, and I want to see some new ones because I think I just put
Okay.
them back on the top of the deck. So
Oh, sure,
hold
sure.
on, we'll draw a different one. All right. The background that they were recently betrayed by a figure, which would be interesting because we have lots of betrayals going on. A trait is that they're free spirited. A trait is that they have a specific taboo involving a material or a living creature, or that they have an agenda where they want to study or protect a text or document.
What is so genius about this is like already my mind is starting to build out these stories just from these few prompts, right? So the one that immediately stuck out to me was they have a taboo about either a material or a creature, which
Love it.
might fit into why there was a betrayal and they committed a war crime,
Yeah, yeah. Because
right?
especially if you have a really strong like no-go zone belief, then that gives you a boundary
Yeah,
that if it's crossed, you're gonna be like, no, we're done.
exactly.
Yeah.
See, this is really just a tremendous extension of sort of the core world building functionality of the deck of worlds, because you're starting to add micro story to the world that you're building. And now your background is in sort of short form story, isn't that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. A lot of microfiction writing. A lot of like, can I fit a little story or a little world onto something the size of a postcard?
How much did that influence the way you chose prompts
I think
for this
I think there were
project?
I think there were two things that from that experience that really contributed to the way that I write prompts, and not just for Loremaster's deck, but also for Deck of Worlds and Story
Mm-hmm.
Engine. I think the two things were one, because I was writing a new story idea or a new world idea once or twice a week. I learned to not be precious about the ideas, like to understand
Mm-hmm.
like if this one doesn't work out, the next idea might be better. So like not being too obsessed with making it perfect was one
Mm-hmm.
thing that really helped be able to work with prompts and let go of some of that like perfection instinct that can sometimes make it harder to create.
Mm-hmm.
And on that same note, I'd say that also by not being precious, it gives you permission to change things, right? If you're like so attached to the idea that this has to be a church, that this faction has to be a church, and I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
even consider that they're a division or a mob or a nation, or that
Mm-hmm.
that's part of their structure, then you often miss other pathways that you could have taken to like tell a story where maybe if instead of a church, they were like a particular sect of a church, or they were like a division within a church, or they were
Mm-hmm.
like a religious nation. Um, by keeping yourself unattached to like one interpretation and being more open to considering other ways of doing things, you widen the palette that you can use to paint your world or your story. So yeah, not being precious was one, and then the other thing that writing microfiction gave me was it gave me a lot of faith that readers and writers are really good at filling in blanks by themselves.
Yeah.
You can't put a lot on a postcard, so you have to leave a lot up to the imagination. And the prompt system works because there's not that much written on the card, right? Like there's
Mm-hmm.
a pretty minimal. I don't tell you what the material or creature is. I don't tell you what the war crime is. The
Mm-hmm.
cards might, and they're going to give you suggestions for what that could be. But you can also choose not to draw a card and just decide, like, oh, I know what I want that to be, or I can already fill
Yeah.
that in. And I think having faith that people are like inherently creative, they will use their imaginations to fill in gaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is actually a topic that we've talked about, like leaving room for
Right.
wonder, leaving room for the imagination and for the reader or the visitor to do some of that work of filling in the world
Mm-hmm.
makes for good world building, and I think it makes for a good prompting system. Because like the lesson that I learned from right from the get-go with even just the first story engine was don't try and do the work for the writer. Like just leave them a lot of room to do the work themselves, and the
Mm-hmm.
results they get are going to be better. The deck is going to be more helpful and effective.
Mm-hmm.
And Yeah, and like learning to get out of the way of and not overwrite the prompts was like one of the hardest lessons, and definitely required a little bit of ego death, because you have to remember like, oh, the point is not about me being creative, the point is about the end user being creative and them having something to work with. Yeah, so that's what I found.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So microfiction is something that is very close to our hearts at the Worldcraft Club. We love it, and the sort of the genius of sort of giving people small building blocks, right? It reminds me of Lego. You know,
Uh,
each individual piece is very specific. It's not like when you look at a block that is, you know, 2 by 2, like it's what it is. It's not going to change. But blocks can be combined to create just the most astounding things. You know, tapping into that inherent creativity in the writer and in the reader. This just is, man, I'm always just so impressed when I see it and when I think about it.
it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to see people pick it up and use it, and like that moment where it clicks with like, oh, I can build what I want with this.
Mm-hmm.
And like with Lego, like I feel like I don't know if this is just my experience as like a kid, but like when I was a kid, we didn't have like a Lego set that was like designed to build one thing. It wasn't like, oh, this
Mm-hmm.
is like, now I'll see like, oh, you can like build a pizza shop, or you can build a replica model of the castle from Monty Python. I don't know if
Right.
these sets exist,
Yeah.
but like for instances, when I was a kid, we just had like one box of random Lego, like the
Yep.
most random pieces, and it like required you to decide what you wanted to build and make, and to
That's
build it
right.
yourself and model it. And I think what I like, or what I think makes for the most effective prompting and creative systems, not just like in the tools that I build, but in the tools that I look for out in the world, are ones where they do not force you to like end up with something that is this particular shape, but that are an open-ended
Mm-hmm.
tool for like, build whatever the heck you want. Like go ahead and just and run with it and stick blocks on blocks and see what comes out.
Yeah.
And really, it is like the shape that emerges from those larger structures that the writer chooses that are the
Mm-hmm.
ones that are going to be interesting and compelling and useful to them, and that are going to make the deck reusable. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
thing that I've found. Like, Story Engine Deck was released in 20. I launched it on crowdfunding in 2019, and then it was out in 2020. And I still have not like made the same story twice with it. I just like
Right.
every time I go to it, there's something new that comes out of it. And it's because meaning emerges from the gaps between cards, from the spaces to
Mm-hmm.
interpret, and from the context of one card next to each other and the way that they kind of resonate off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of recombinability is just like really good for creative stimulation, and I think it makes for a good, useful product, because like someone can just keep going back to it and finding, and they can draw from a new well every time, basically.
Yeah, and it also speaks to that idea of not having not being so committed to your end goal that you can't organically make changes as you're moving through the process. I remember as a kid, you know, sometimes my spaceship would end up as a submarine, right?
Yeah.
As I was building, I would I would spark a cool idea halfway through and I would be able to shift, right? And so I think that with stories, with world building, that's one of those vital skills, is the ability to sort of sift through the ideas and see what emerges to the top, see what the cream of the world or the setting really is.
Yeah, absolutely. I
So,
think it's such a good piece of advice of like, yeah, just be open to that. You are getting to know your world. You are a visitor in
mhm,
it to a certain extent,
yeah.
and that
Oh, I love that idea.
and being open to what you discover there.
Hmm.
Like I think for anyone who's done tabletop role playing games, like so many times you'll go in, you'll build a character, you'll go in, and then when you start role playing them, you discover that there's someone a little bit different than you thought they
Yeah.
were on paper. And if you try to stick only to the vision that you originally set out with, you're going to find this like weird tension between like the character you think they're supposed to be and the character they are, and being a little bit open to like adjusting that game plan, being less attached to an idea, and being open to like exploring that process is really
Hmm.
important for like good role play. And I feel like same thing for world building, like being open to the world having its own kind of life, getting to know it, adapting
Hmm.
to the ways that you find it, and being willing to like acknowledge those changes and work with them leads to some like really interesting, fun, and very organic results.
Absolutely. So I'd love to talk a little bit about your philosophy on the role of lore in world building, because we have the deck of worlds, which sort of builds the physical spaces of the world. We have the story engine, which builds stories that happen in those places. And now we're adding a new layer, and you're separating it out and saying, okay, now we have lore. So I'd love to talk about how you feel like lore is different from sort of the concrete world that is being built, and where the crossover is.
Yeah, so interestingly, like the deck of worlds is kind of almost a abstract map making tool when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
It really focused on mapping relationships in terms of space. What is next to what? Where are those things positioned? And a lot of meaning emerges from what is next to something else, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a city that is next to a lake has a water supply. It matters that it's next to a lake. A coastal city is going to be different from one that's inland. A city with access to woods is going to be different from one that has access to fields. So those
Yeah.
things matter. But it's not the only way of going about building a world. Loremaster's deck was very much an exploration in what if we mapped worlds in terms of the relationships between the things in the world that are important and the points of interest that like if you were going to see this world as like an abstract painting, what elements would you render in really quickly? What
Mm-hmm.
really matters for anchoring and understanding what this world is? So how do we map those relationships between a faction and say the founder who left that faction and is now an independent, and
Mm-hmm.
the city that that faction leader lives in, and the primary like export resource of that city, and then the creature in the outlying area in the ecosystem that resource is harvested from. Like, what are those connections that map those things, and how do we map those connections?
Mm-hmm.
So it became about mapping relationships in terms of like connections and causality, and then it also is a deck about mapping relationships in terms of time. One of the sort of features of it that I'm really excited about is that if you do a event deck based prompt where you just lay out a bunch of events next to each
Mm-hmm.
other with some branches off of them to look at who was involved, or what locations or what objects or artifacts were involved in those moments, you can create timelines. You can do like a very like a broad brush timeline map. So yeah, it really is a shift from trying to map space to trying to map relationships, trying to
So
map connections.
that's that's fascinating to think about lore as the connections between all of the different events that have happened. And we're not just, I mean, it's not just mapping, though, the event itself, right? But it's mapping the relationships between all of the parties involved,
Yeah,
right? And parties in this case, doesn't have to be a person. Like you said, it can be a resource, it can be a creature or a plant that only grows in a specific area,
yeah.
right? And I I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating to, when you look at a world or when you're exploring a world, even as the creator, to identify what is most important in it, because it's those pillars on which our scaffolding for our world is created, right? And you've mentioned that you've sort of learned to trust the author or the reader, the writer or the reader, to fill in the blanks, right? And that's a philosophy, a world building philosophy that we really embrace here at the Worldcraft Club. And so this idea of lore being something that you add to the physical space of your world, do you think that there is a upper limit to sort of how much is good?
Yeah, I think that there is in terms of well, like I guess let's talk about world building as an activity unto itself, and then world building as a precursor to writing or running a tabletop RPG
Mm,
game or some other activity that
that's a
takes
great
place in the world.
distinction.
Because I
That's a
think
really
that's an
good
important,
distinction.
yeah, I think it's an important one to talk about here. Because if you're world building to world build, then I'd say there's no upper limit. Do whatever you want, be as detailed as you want, and if that activity for you is like gratifying and fulfilling, then like no one can stop you and no one should stop you. Just
Hmm.
like run with it. Um, the moment you start looking at, am I going to make this into like a setting that I like publish as like a wiki or a world anvil setting that I want people to be able to flick into and explore, then I think you start looking at, okay, well, what are the most important parts of the world? What defines it? What are the highlights? Um, and I would sort of make those decisions based on either what is most connected to other things, like it clearly
Mm-hmm.
is a central part of all of the threads that hold your world together, um, and then what maybe doesn't have a ton of connections, but has one connection that's so important that if you severed it, though, you would actually see the gap left behind in the world.
Hmm.
And I think what you'll find is that some lore elements kind of can be replaced. Like you don't need 55 taverns if the story that you're telling or the world that you're going to tell, like if there's going to be one place that like it's the hearth that feels like home when your adventure is on the road,
Mm-hmm.
then don't don't worry about having 1,000 taverns. You only need one that's going to create that sense of home. So like if home
Mm-hmm.
is one place or just a couple places, decide what places feel like home, and then you can probably remove those other pieces because they would be like redundant. And it's the same thing with like I think this happens a lot, especially in screenwriting with like movie scripts. You trim a lot down to get a movie down to like an hour and a half and feel satisfying. So a lot of the time, like you'll start with more supporting characters, and you
Mm-hmm.
realize like this character only needs like one friend who's like the supporting friend who's going to be there when like things
Mm-hmm.
go wrong and support them. How we can like remove some of these characters and collapse it down to like one or two characters in that role. I think you can do the same thing with world building. Like if this city is meant to hit the beat of like a city that is like very militaristic,
Mm-hmm.
then you don't need a bunch of different like military autocracy cities. Just let that one be the one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then when it comes time to actually write, that's where I think like deciding what you don't have to say and that people will get
Mm-hmm.
is a skill that's like learned with time, but I think is really important and fun, and is like one of those best flourishes of world building. And it creates those moments where, when you are inevitably successful and you have a movie adaptation of your amazing fantasy novel, your like hardcore fans will be like, they'll tell they'll be the annoying person in the theater telling their friends like,
Yeah.
that the like sigil on that character's belt is because he was the warden keeper of like the Kingswood 300 years ago, and that's like a little nod to like that's what you want
Yeah.
to not have to explain in the story, but to have people piece together from the little threads. That's where like you want to leave them the room for like the detectives to have a lot of fun with that and figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I every time I talk about world building, it seems to come back around to this idea that this is not a it's not just a solo act, right? As you said, there's space for people who want to just world build for their own pleasure. They have an idea, they want to explore it, and it's fun to do. I do that myself, right? I have notebooks literally filled with ideas and places that I wanted to visit. And so I went and I visited them. And I don't know that I'll ever share them with anybody. But the idea that world building is just that, I think is it it lacks something that the human connection that world building can give uh, provides. And I really love this idea that as a world builder, we're not just building things for sort of the sake of building them, but we're building them because we can create connection with other people. And that connection comes through that exploration and that discovery, right? And so as you're flipping out prompts and you're coming up with all of these ideas, what's genius about this is that given like somebody else, given the same exact flips, like if we set the deck up exactly the same way, is going to come up with a totally different and unique story, a different world for us to explore. And that is just magic. It's
Yeah,
just pure magic.
I think almost every deck I've released, there's been a game mode where you both use the same set of cards to build two different things, and you compare how those choices were
Mm-hmm.
made, and where you use not just the same set of cards, but the same set of prompts, like the same final set of prompts, and you both write from that and see how different it becomes.
Yeah.
And again, because there's enough room left for interpretation for the person who's like visiting this world to bring something of their own, yeah, you can end up with two completely different takes on what a church is.
I love that.
Like for some people, a church will be a really benevolent presence that offers like support and spiritual meaning,
Hmm.
and for some people, it will be like a colonizing force that
Hmm.
destroys and dehumanizes. And both of those experiences are correct to the people who had them.
Right.
And good world building acknowledges that there's like a variety of perspectives about what each thing in that world means, because
Hmm.
everybody's going to have a different experience. Like, you know, in our world, this is why like I really advocate for not just doing like God's eye world building, where like this faction means one thing.
Right.
Like name one political party that everyone agrees is the good political party.
Right.
It doesn't happen because there's a huge diversity of opinions,
Hmm.
and like some people love New York, some people hate New York.
Hmm.
There's always going to be these different takes and perspectives, and I think the more that you can lean into whose perspective am I inhabiting with the narrative voice in this moment,
Hmm.
whose assumptions am I reinforcing, um, that's like a really good skill to have in being able to render a world that feels like it's lived in by a bunch of different kinds of people. Um,
Yeah, it's that humanizing element
yeah,
of saying life is not simply black and white. It is not so clear cut. There are a million shades of gray in between, and depending on where you're standing, they're going to look different.
yeah,
I think that's a really wise way to go about it, and I think it's also really effective from a novelist's point of view. Giving your characters that depth to make them human, and acknowledging that, even even acknowledging that sometimes their way of looking at the world isn't right. So we just built out this prompt with a church that's committed a war crime, right? If you pull any of the members of that church off the street and stick a microphone in their face and say, hey, what about that war crime? They're probably going to be like, what are you talking about?
that was
That
our
wasn't
moment
a
of
war
greatest
crime.
victory. That was our
Right?
crowning achievement.
Exactly.
Yeah,
you know and I think that like story is found in those conflicts, in those moments, right?
yeah. Who decides what the world means is
That's
such
right.
a interesting question, um, both in the the way you choose to frame your story
Hmm.
and in the power struggle for like who decides within that world what the world means, who's controlling the narrative and the perspective within the world is also a really interesting question.
Right.
So yeah, I like there's just there's so much rich material in those spaces, and I like always be curious about those moments because there's so much you can discover if like you are open to thinking about and learning
Hmm.
from it.
You said earlier in the conversation something that I think is just incredibly valuable, and that is that the the creator in a world building exercise is doing as much exploring as the reader is, with the end product, whatever that end product looks like. Your visitant and your world builder are not so far apart in terms of the exploration that they're doing. And so I think, keeping that open mind as an explorer or a world builder who's stepping in and not necessarily, prescribing how everything has to turn out, not necessarily demanding of the setting that it go a certain way. I think that there's a lot of power in that to create settings that really draw readers, that draw the visitant in, right?
Yeah, I had an experience of that recently in my home D&D campaign. My wife is Filipina, and I was growing up in Canada, where like when Filipinos find each other in any city in Canada, there's often like an instant moment of like recognition or connection. Not and like this
Hmm.
is not to say this is universally true for all Filipinos, but it's a thing that happens a lot. Is like Filipinos will find each other and they'll start a conversation about their experience in this city. And so when I was building the setting that the game's taking place in, which is kind of a like great ships age of exploration maritime setting with a lot of different islands. She decided to play a gnome, and gnomes have a lot in common, just in like a checklist of like with the Filipino experience as immigrants, where like these
Hmm.
diaspora communities, smaller scattered groups in countries where they are not the majority demographic, but they'll often like uplift and support each other.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, I was looking at gnomes in an entirely different way,
Yeah.
and she kind of pitched just through the way that she was playing the character. an experience of gnomes, at least on the island that our story was starting in, that was like really parallel to Filipino diaspora, of like being seen as a certain sub community, having expectations placed on you and how you're going to behave, and whether or not you're taken seriously, or at least seen in the way that you want to be seen by the communities that you participate in. And that was like not an element that I thought we were going to be exploring in the game, but it was
Yeah.
such like a good and interesting and emotionally complex experience to get to participate in
Hmm.
as a storyteller and a role player. Where like, okay, let's explore what it means to be, one of like three gnomes on this island, or
Yeah.
one of like a handful of gnomes on this island, um, and the ways that you both lean into and try and push back against the expectations that are placed on you because of that role.
Hmm.
And that became like a really cool exploration, again, because I was open to, and because my wife was open to, like, what if we are not attached to what gnomes usually mean in fantasy, and what if we
Right.
instead lean into or explore, right? Like explore,
Right.
be curious about this particular aspect um, of the way that they could be rendered in a world.
Hmm.
That's, I think, again, such a good example of how the visitant is a collaborator, right? And
Yes.
it's a little bit different in open role play, where like really they are creating story and creating meaning in the world directly. But even like, if you think about even just in a novel,
Hmm.
the reader is your 3D render software that is literally rendering the environment of your world.
That's right.
What you have before that is just a script that is not in a computer being rendered. That's what you've made. It is really the reader who is the collaborator, who like renders that space and creates a real and subjective experience of it as they read. And I think that, yeah, we've like undervalued how much like work and participation that involves from a reader.
Hmm.
And I think that's why like it's so interesting every time there is a movie adaptation of a book. One of the things that we're all leaning in to see is like, what does this render look like? How does this
Hmm.
person imagine Middle Earth? How does this person imagine Westeros? How does this person imagine Star Wars? And we've
Hmm.
seen Star Wars rendered a bunch of different times and ways, and it feels like Star Wars, but there's also something that feels different and distinct about a number of the locations or takes or director looks at what the setting means. So yeah, I think there's very much like a sense of participation that comes from that reader, and I think that's always really fun to lean into.
Yeah. Man, this I love talking about this subject. I do want to shift the conversation very slightly,
Yeah,
and I want to talk a little bit about once you've used this product, once you have set out your prompts and you've started to build your web of lore, I want to talk about your experience of then taking that and doing something with it. Because I think that the exercise of world building is really helpful. But one of the places it's most valuable is as a kickstart to producing something, right?
yeah,
And so, whether that is a TTRPG, whether that is a novel, whether that is a short story, microfiction, whatever it is, I'm curious about sort of your process and your experience of taking, first of all, the story engine deck, then the deck of worlds, and now the lore masters deck, and taking them and turning them into sort of a product that somebody else can consume. So,
yeah.
can you
So
talk me through that a little bit?
yeah, I would love to. The like how you turn pre-writing into writing, and then how you turn writing into publishing, are both like really interesting questions and complicated ones, and it depends on what your goals are. In terms of like taking, say, a web that you created with the Lore Masters deck and turning that into writing, I would say let your relationship to the prompts that you've created be the relationship between like a chef and then the contents of their cupboard. You're not going
Hmm.
to like invite someone to your house and then just say like help yourself and like gesture to your like an entire cupboard of like dry pasta and beans and
Right.
vegetables and whatever. You're going to like cook a meal, and these are your ingredients. So I would think of that pre-writing, the world building, where like you've developed some interesting factions, some interesting characters, locations. You've developed like a couple of cool material resources that are important to this world that might be part of like the magic system. You've got a couple of interesting creatures or species. Maybe you've got like one big world-destroying monster. These are now your ingredients. And I think the
Mm.
next step, and something that we'll definitely include some support for in the guidebook, is like, what kind of meal are you going to plate with this? Um, And for there, that's where like thinking about your audience is helpful. Like if you're like trying to do something for like say people who read horror, then focusing on the big world-ending monster is going to get you a little bit further than like the like really happy fairy circle in the woods.
Right.
Um, so like figuring out like what, yeah, depending on what kind of genre you're trying to
Yeah.
serve, being able to think about that will be helpful. And I think the two sort of biggest questions that we're going to focus on in the support material will be um, who is the story about? Who are like the biggest stakeholders in this world? And that's where I would
Hmm.
recommend looking at starting with figures and factions, because those are the kinds of stories that just like we as you know, we are not creature species, we are not physical material resources in the world, we are not locations, we are people, and we relate to
Right.
stories about people or things that have people like motivations. So I'd say like look at your figures and factions and specifically look at their agendas. Like what do they want? What are they
Hmm.
trying to do in the world, and what are the obstacles to them achieving that? So
Hmm.
going through and looking at like, well, is this faction the obstacle to this character completing their character arc, or is like reaching this location? If that's their agenda, then what is stopping them from reaching the location? What does that journey look like? I would do an inventory basically of your world to figure out like what is the protein or the main event in this meal going to be, and ultimately, I think that you're going to get the best material out of looking at um, who are the stakeholders in this world who feel the most connected or have the highest stakes in um, deciding what the world means or who makes meaning in the world.
Hmm.
What do they want, and what are the obstacles to that? And I think that's where your story is going to be. Um, and being able to adjust the elements to fit, say, like if a certain theme is emerging, or if you are again going for the horror vibe, then being able to like even like adjust some of the choices you may have made in the prompts. Because like when we did the little sample here earlier, every card has multiple options. You get to pick an option. You can go
Hmm.
back and change those choices later. You can completely ignore the card if the card was just a starting point to getting you to decide something else that's going to be interesting or relevant
Hmm.
or useful about the setting. The cards really are just like the starting line, and they're really just meant to get you thinking about and a few solid points around your lore, and
Hmm.
from there you can just sort of pick it up and run with it. So the next step that I would do is like re-examining the choices that you've made in your lore web, and if you want to change any of those to better support what you now think the like emotional core of your story is going to be, then be
Hmm.
open to that. Again, be curious about your world, be willing to explore it and the opportunities that it could provide. um, yeah, and then from there, just I think a lot of good stories can be diagrammed as who is it about, what do they want, and what sort of shape does that want or desire or motivation take? What are the obstacles to getting it, or what price will they have to pay to get it, and then what will happen if they do?
Hmm.
And I think you can find something really good there. And that's more for like a novel. For an open ended tabletop role playing game sort of thing. You're creating a setting for your characters. I'd say like the next step is um, write up some of these loose notes, send them to your players, and then ask like, where do you see yourself fitting in this world? And being even able to highlight either interesting factions or locations or belief systems that they might belong to, or like current conflicts in the events that they might have a connection to, is going to be a really good way to like plant the feet of their characters firmly in the earth of your setting,
Hmm.
and really give them like a place to stand for what their character is, that's connected to the lore. Because I think that you just get so much more. There's so much more storytelling material that you can really use to involve characters in the world when they
Hmm.
have those established connections within it.
Yeah, you're sort of creating a set of anchors
Yeah.
that are going to cause them to invest, and then from that investment you get to tap into their creativity in how the world continues to expand.
Yeah.
One of the experiences that I have fairly often as I write is that I will start writing and then will find that my story is taking a different direction or a different shape than I originally thought it was, right? Kind of going back to that idea of, well, I started out trying to build a spaceship and now here I am with a submarine. You know, one of the things I love about sort of the practical elements of these of the story engine, of the deck of worlds, and I'm sure when I get to play with Loremaster's deck, it's going to be the same, is the ability to adjust on the fly, the ability to say, well, this is going a different direction than I originally thought. I originally thought this was cosmic horror. Now maybe it's like dark comedy. And I either want to adjust what I've already created or I want to flip out new, new prompts. And because you're holding loosely these ideas because you're not saying, well, the card said it's this, therefore it must be this. You're opening yourself up to sort of this creative space of being able to make connections that you may not have, organically really been able to think of on your own. Instead, these prompts are driving you in specific directions. This is one of the reasons that with the Worldcraft Club we speak so often about boundaries, right? Giving yourself a core concept, a place to start, which is sort of what these elements are, and then sort of setting some boundaries as you go. Well, the deck automatically creates some of those boundaries as you make decisions, walking through it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the helpful things about having 4 options on the card and only 4 sides to each card is that you're not suddenly drowning in like too much choice, but you have
Yeah.
enough choice that you can find a meaningful option that's going to expand your world the right way. And what I have found very organically, and I am curious to like discover through more playtesting how this works for other creators, but what I found organically is that there comes a point physically on the table space that the prompt is occupying,
Yeah.
as well as just in terms of like the number of different connections that you can spread your attention across, where you're like, this feels like enough. This feels
Yeah.
like I can work with this. And I think something that we'll probably be doing in the guidebook, which I have not drafted yet, but when I get more user feedback, I'll start drafting is, every 3 prompts, do you check in and ask, like, do I know what the story is about? Do I have enough to create the next thing without pulling more cards? And if you do, then that is a good signal that you don't need to create more. You can if you want to, right? Like, again,
Yeah.
the pre-writing can be if your goal is not to publish and your goal is just to spend time being creative with yourself in the same way that like spending time doing yoga is like good for your
Right.
body and mind, then like just keep do that as much as you want, and don't make the time limit like, is this useful?
Right.
But once you reach the point where like, oh, this is useful for the other thing I want to do, which is write, then trying to figure out like when does it feel like there's enough. And I think that'll be a self assessment that depends on what you're trying to build.
Sure.
But if you can answer the question for yourself, like, what is this story about and where does it take place and who is it about, then you probably have enough to start to start the writing party and making that happen. So yeah, I think that's yeah, and yeah, it's interesting because like not just with world building, but like even just like when I'm plotting out a story or like thinking about what I want a poem to be about, and I'm like scattering down a bunch of images that I want to put together in the poem or something. Like, when have you done enough pre-writing is one of those like such a subjective question, and it's so hard to figure out. And I don't think that there'll ever be like a clear answer. But
right, because it depends on your creative process. It depends on what you want out of it.
Yeah.
And it really is something you have to refine over time.
Yeah.
I used to do a lot more pre-writing than I do now, but part of that is just because with practice, I've built a lot of sort of these frameworks and structures in my head that allow me to shortcut the process. But I know other writers who do way more pre-writing now than they did before because they find it super helpful to, fully flesh out and explore all of these things. And I love that your tool is flexible in that way, right? It allows for the creativity of the author or the game master, whoever is using it. It allows for their creativity to be sort of the focal point and the thing that shines. It's not there to replace their world building. It's there to sort of set them off on the journey and provide them tools along the way. So yeah. I think it's really impressive.
Well, thanks a lot. I think that the making that possible through design really just meant thinking about like the person who uses this is going to be creative and smart and be able to do going to be able to build with it what they want, and just trying to leave it open-ended so that someone who isn't you can step in and do something fun and interesting with it is like definitely the core of the design challenge. And sometimes it's very easy and sometimes it's very hard, because the Loremaster deck is the one that I have. It's an alpha right now. It's like been the full deck has been written. There's a small team of writers standing by to write punch up on it and diversify the prompts and make them more interesting and different from each other than just what I could do on my own with the first draft. But the alpha has had I haven't had a chance to share it with like a huge group of writers yet. So I am excited to start doing some of that early feedback and getting a sense of like, how do other brains use this tool? What parts of it are like too specific or too broad? What parts are too flexible or not flexible enough? And doing that iterating. But so far is like, for me, ISO sandbox tool that I've been playing with for the last several months. It's been so much fun. It's been so much fun
Yeah.
to just like sit down and all right, it is my job to playtest this. I get to go
Yeah,
make
that's
up
so awesome.
I get to go make up a new world for an hour
Right.
to make sure that this thing works the way that I think it works. And what a delight to have on my task list for the day.
So that makes me curious. At what point did you recognize the need for the Lore Masters deck? Right, because we talked about how the deck of worlds really is about the space, building out the space of a world. At what point did you suddenly say, "Oh, wait, we also need something that's going to explore this web of relationships inside this space"?
So the Lore Masters deck started out as I was looking at releasing a bunch of expansions that wouldn't necessarily be tied to Deck of Worlds or a Story Engine deck, but I wanted to have like a little deck for building species, a little deck for building
Okay.
factions. I had all these different ideas, and then the more I was playing with them independently and drafting material for them, the more I was like, well, what if this faction was like an animal cult?
Right.
Um, okay, and like this animal, it really matters where it lives, and so many of the prompts
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing for indicate where it lives. What if rather than like having to in this giant bank of prompts that I'm writing about like animal behaviors, their social behavior, their hunting behavior, their diet, their morphology. What if in this giant list I didn't have to write out like all the different ecosystems they could live in, and instead there was a number of prompts that just said like they live in this location.
Mm-hmm.
How much more remixable and layerable, and how much more material is there for someone to create connections? What if uh, what if when I'm creating, say, like objects as using the anchor deck from Story Engine deck, what if those were specialized so that I could have like the locations separated out from the objects, and we could learn about the properties of the objects and also the properties of the material and where those materials come from. And those materials can come from locations and creatures. Those materials can be stockpiled by factions. The more I realized that the genres of prompts that I was writing uh, didn't have to be limited when those prompts could call on other card types to fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
The more I realized, like, oh, it's about the connections, right? It's about
Right.
what links the A to B, and that's where, just from a design perspective, that's where you can have so much more relayerability and remixability and recombinability,
Mm-hmm.
because rather than having to like pick, I can only fit 12 prompts about where a creature lives. Suddenly, every single prompt that I've ever created for a location can be the answer to where that creature lives, and
Right.
that's structured into the cards themselves. Um, yeah, that was a very eye-opening moment, and then just figuring out how to make sure that those connections work and were balanced across the different card types
Mm-hmm.
became like that longer drafting process. But once that was figured out, it was like, oh, this is a lot of fun,
That's so
and
cool.
it's neat because it reminds you that your world is connected, right? It reminds
Right.
you that each of these pieces has a chance to talk to another, and that you don't just have to have like a linear structure for like, okay,
Right.
this lore connects to this order, this order. It can be a web. Things can
Yeah.
cross connect and combine in surprising ways, and especially when you end up with like triangles of motivations, where like
Yes.
um, this faction is trying to hunt down this defector, but this defector is under the protection of another allied faction that's connected to that faction.
Mm-hmm.
How do you resolve a dispute like that? Like, I just
Right.
love seeing when the threads get tangled, and that's often where the story is, right? Is where you end up.
That is
Yeah,
absolutely where the story is, because that's where the conflict is.
yeah,
And so immediately, I mean, you mention that, and immediately a story is springing to mind of like, how would I resolve that?
yeah,
And so that's that's really cool. Well, we are coming to the end of our time here, but June 20th on BackerKit,
yeah.
the campaign for the Lore Masters deck is going to go live. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah, the URL will be storyenginedeck.com/lore. That's where you'll find the
Okay.
campaign page. It'll
And is that
redirect.
up right now, or
Yeah, right now, if you go to storyenginedeck.lore, storyenginedeck.com/lore, it'll redirect you to the sort of the pre-launch page. You can sign up for a launch
cool?
notification, and then once it's live, that'll redirect to the actual project.
Okay, awesome. Well, I cannot recommend this enough to our listeners. Seriously, like these these tools are incredibly effective and they are easy to use. And those two things combine together into something that is eminently practical, right? I have, for most of my worlds that I have built for most of my novels, I have flipped something out. And again, whether I use the entire thing or just pieces of it, it's the deck of worlds has sort of acted as this starting point, this kernel from which the garden is being grown. And I'm really excited to get my hands on the Loremaster's deck as well and check that out, exploring the connections between the beings and the objects that inhabit a world is just so fun. And so I'm really pumped for this. Thank you very much for coming on and talking to us about it. Where can people find you?
You can find me. My handle is usually at Rock Paper Cynic on most social media. But for Story Engine Deck stuff, you'll want to check out. We're at Story Engine Deck on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I think that's pretty sure it's our username on YouTube. That's where you can find us and check out things. Also, if you just like want to try out Story Engine, I always recommend checking out the free demo. This is a good way to like figure out, hey, does this fit my process? Same thing, we have one for Deck of Worlds you can download for free. You can find that at storyenginedeck.com/demo. Just see, like, hey, is this a good thing for me? Is this going to work for me?
Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. It's always a pleasure.
It's always so much fun.